And I call the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Change is tough. It brings uncertainty, anxiety, fear. And for farmers, they are living and working in an environment that is in a constant state of change. The weather, the market, the rules, the price. There is so little that farmers have control over. They rely on their good farming practices, the discipline to rise out of bed before dawn, the skills to fix and repair, and the relationships to see their mates and their families through the tough times and the great. I'm not saying this from a theoretical perspective. I'm saying it from a lived experience. From my grandparents settling on country on Carnama and Cadoo in the WA wheat belt, to my sister, building on the success of generations with her husband and family on their farm in York. And York is where I grew up. A beautiful farming community representing so much and responsible for so much of our cereal crops, the wheat, the barley, oats, and grazing sheep. Of course for meat, but particularly for their merino wool. I've seen firsthand the toll that farming takes on farmers, families and towns when things out of their control are difficult. I've also seen how those same communities are resilient and rise to every challenge, adopting new technologies, new genetics, new advances in agronomics to create more food and more wealth, not just for those living in these small towns, but in our cities, our state, and in nations abroad. So when I was asked to temporarily cover for my colleague and great friend, the member for Gilmore, on the House Standing Committee for Agriculture, to inquire into the banning of the live sheep trade, I willingly took up the opportunity because I knew that the change being proposed in this bill could be tough without understanding the impact and consequences. Change needs to come, but we need to ensure that farmers are then best positioned to not just deal with the change, but to come out stronger for it. Western Australia has 18% of Australia's sheep flock, or around 12.6 million sheep, and Western Australia last year exported fewer than 600,000 of those animals live. So live sheep export only exists still in WA. For over the last 20 years, the value of that export has declined dramatically by about 90%, to the point where it is now worth about $77 million. The government's budgeted transition package exceeds this amount, and our committee has recommended the consideration of more. In other comparable countries such as the UK and New Zealand, and even just here on the East Coast, live exports were phased out without a transition package, and with either much shorter transition periods or none at all, as it was deemed commercially unviable as more productive markets emerged and the farmers just simply moved on. But I know that $77 million is still a significant sum for the communities from Darwin to Wagen through Esperance in the south. It supports the vibrancy of the towns, shops, sports clubs, and the $77 million does provide the certainty needed for the shearing teams to schedule their move across the wheat belt, for the truck drivers to schedule their pickups to port, and critically, for farmers to know that they have a market to sell to when their weathers are not optimal for wool or where the processors are overbooked. So with this in mind, I was determined to hear the perspectives of those directly impacted: farmers, shearers, processors, abattoir workers, truck drivers, shearers, vets, and also from those many people across the nation who want to see Australia stand for better welfare of animals. The volume of engagement was enormous. There were over 13,000 contributions to the inquiry on the bill over the past few weeks. I do note that most of those submissions support the passage of this bill, but I'm not diminishing in any way the weight of those who oppose it, and I will return to this shortly. And this engagement is on top of the engagement undertaken by the independent panel consulting on the phase-out of live sheep exports by sea, comprised of the Chair, Philip Glyde, the Honourable Warren Snowden, Miss Sue Middleton, a local to the Wheatbelt area in WA, and Miss Heather Neal. The panel met with over 2,000 individuals, held 96 stakeholder meetings and received more than 800 submissions and 3,300 survey responses across the 9 months between March and October 2023. And at the recent committee hearings, both here and in Canberra and at Mures Ag College in WA Wheatbelt, just outside of Northern, we heard there also from people on all aspects of agriculture, business, trade and civil society. In listening to the witnesses who gave evidence to the inquiry, these are the themes that came through for me. Firstly, there was a unanimous agreement that the welfare of all sheep being shipped was paramount, and that since more than 2,400 sheep died of heat stress on the Awassi Express voyage in August 2017, significant improvements had been achieved that has seen a much reduced average mortality rate in recent years. In 2022, the average was 0.14%. The second theme, though, was there was not agreement on the extent that morbidity issues experienced for the weeks on board were a welfare issue of concern. Concerns were raised around starvation of sheep, the ship motion, ammonia exposure, heat stress, stocking density, unhygienic environments from standing in the faeces, unnatural lighting, scabby mouth and respiratory infections. The heat stress is particularly problematic. Ammonia builds up on board, creating humidity, which leads to the wet bulb temperature increasing beyond the heat stress threshold of the sheep, which leads to suffering. The most recent shipments that departed for Jordan and Saudi Arabia in the last few weeks sailed into conditions where temperatures were even exceeding 52 degrees. Hundreds of humans died in this last couple of weeks. We don't know yet the fate of the sheep on board, and because there's no independent vet, fortunately, at this point, due to the security issues in the region. And it is worth also noting that the temperatures involved in the Awassi tragedy were in their mid-30s. Therefore, on this matter, I've accepted the advice of the independent vets and believe morbidity is a welfare concern. This is coupled with the reality that Australians hold the view, as evidenced by our national processing practices, that our sheep should be killed humanely, and sadly those on arrival into the Middle East do not experience such a fate. The third theme I heard was the opportunities to keep the sheep in WA and process them domestically are real, just as evidenced by the success here on the East Coast. Many witnesses spoke about their concerns that if farmers destocked because of a failure to find a market, that then their towns would suffer significantly. However, there was the recognition that if the numbers were held, then towns, particularly those that support abattoirs, would in fact grow. To quote Matthew Journeau, Federal Secretary of Australasian Meat Industries Employers Union, regardless of whether those animals are exported live or are processed locally, all of the jobs up to the sheep being put on a boat or being processed remain the same. The only difference is if the truck turns right to the ports, the live export sheep are loaded with a handful of stockmen and an Australian vet accompanies their journey, and if the truck turns left and takes those animals to a processing facility, it immediately employs between 500 and 800 people directly and many more in industries that support the processing plant. Those wages are spent into the local communities and flow-on benefits are significant. But the current limitations of WA's abattoirs having sufficient skilled labour, regional accommodation, feedlots, cold room capacity and critically ensuring that the processors themselves are competitive and by extension the supermarkets to offer the farmers a fair farm gate price are of paramount importance to first resolve. The fourth theme, though, was the confidence in the prospects of new markets to displace the live export market of some 500,000 sheep per annum is good, particularly on the back of new trade agreements finalised by this government with the UK and India and perhaps in the EU and UAE, plus the growth in demand for mutton to China, which, as Mr Patrick Hutchinson from the Australian Meat Industry Council indicated, would be able to absorb the greater expected quantity as a result of this change. He stated that the global mutton market is performing exceptionally strong, and obviously Australia is the biggest exporter of that. With trade into Southeast Asia forecast to grow around 5% year on year, Mr Hutchinson continued, particularly for mutton trade, places like Malaysia, etc., UK for higher value product, and that we do have an opportunity in India. And just yesterday, the Australian agricultural analysis firm, Mercado, noted that the current market for processed sheep meat is strong, Both lamb and mutton volumes are well above a year ago and 5-year average levels for the year to May, with the US and the Middle East soaking up extra supply. Current lamb exports are 25% higher year on year for the January to May period, sitting just shy of 155,000 tonnes. Mutton exports sit 14% above year-ago levels for January to May and 33% more than the 5-year trend, with the month of May also a record for mutton. The Middle East is a demand driver for both markets. The current strength in the market for processed sheep meat and the prospects for growth for many of our export partners mean this is the best time for WA to commence the transition to increase the capacity of processing facilities. Mercado notes that this growth and the multitude of destinations will support processing levels and help protect the farm gate price from large supply. The confidence in growth in the processing sectors is also already evident too, with V&V Walsh investing $50 million in a new cold storage facility and WAMCO, a WA farming cooperative, committed to building a new facility and capacity by 500,000 head by early 2026. And as the Countryman reported in November last year, the newly refurbished Geraldton Meat Exports facility aims to supply chilled and frozen meat products to customers in Malaysia, Singapore and the Middle East. Group Executive Director Mr Saeed Ghazali said the company had customers lined up in Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and he would aim to process the maximum 2,500 head per day of mostly chilled and frozen sheep, mutton and lamb for those markets. So from the themes and just to the report, the committee made 3 recommendations. 1, that this bill be passed. It is time. 2nd, that the government should consider making additional funding available to support the transition. In my view, following discussions with people like Ms Bonnie Skinner, CEO of Sheep Producers Australia, following the hearings, the focus over this next 4 years must be on addressing the structural competition deficiencies in Western Australia in order to achieve a fairer price for farmers. During the committee hearing, due to the variability and fluctuations of price, it was not possible to land on a single dollar value that needs to be bridged for the price achieved through live export by sea. However, there seems consensus that it's around a nominal 15% increase potentially between the specification for mutton and what goes on the boat. So the goal in the transition is to create the competition and markets so farmers get that fairer price for the 11% or so, or the approximate 500,000 head that is currently shipped by sea. For example, what needs to change to enable more of the 29 licensed abattoirs in WA to be certified to international export? Of the 8 current export-accredited abattoirs to process sheep and lamb, what needs to change so that they can do multiple gradings on site, so that the processors start competing with each other for the different sized and aged sheep? We have heard about the success of the East Coast on air freighting sheep to Southeast Asia. However, we can see the volumes have not returned to pre-COVID levels and the air trade is dominated by the East Coast farmers. And I just think there's an opportunity for Western Australia to fill that gap. We heard from experts like Dr Melanie Latter from the Australian Veterinary Association, where she spoke about the options around altering the genetics of the flocks, that they're going to be more suitable for meat markets, for instance, the dual-purpose merino. She also spoke to that veterinarians can assist producers to alter their feeding and nutrition programs, summer cropping, containment feeding on farm, and many other mechanisms so they're actually able to finish off the animals so that they're suitable for processing industries. We heard about the $4.5 billion value in sheep meat exports, sheep meat consumption forecast to grow by 7% domestically and 15% globally. But over the past 8 years, WA has generally sent a higher proportion of sheep meat exports than the national average, but yet we have not seen a return to those COVID levels. So again, an area in which gains can be made. So I call on all of those who will sit around the table to shape the transition package with all of these promising realities in mind, to ensure that the value in growth is not just left to the benefit of our supermarket giants, export agents and processors. A mechanism or model is needed to ensure that the farmers share in that value and are not price gouged. To this end, and a reminder to those opposite and to farmers around the country listening to this today, it is a Labor government that is taking action to address the imbalance of bargaining power between supermarkets and suppliers. We are making the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct mandatory to crack down on anti-competitive behaviour and to get a fairer deal for the farmers and families. And the 3rd recommendation of the report is that the government will continue to work with the WA government on the transition, and we will. And to this end, I thank all those on the committee, the Secretariat in particular, but mostly to all those who appeared before the inquiry for your genuine care and concern to ensure that farmers come out on top, and to all those who have written and spoken with me as well.